Have you ever wondered what would happen if the legends we've heard since childhood were in fact real? What would you do if, on a lonely night, you came across a creature from the shadows, something that defies logic and reason? That's what happened to Jake, a 22-year-old, who was starting his new job as a park ranger in Pine Ridge National Park, a vast conservation area in the state of Wyoming, in 2024. Located away from the big cities, Pine Ridge is a park famous for its lush wildlife, its vast pine forests, and of course for being a waypoint for adventurers and tourists seeking a getaway from the urban hustle and bustle. Jake, who grew up in the small town of Clearwater, always had a love for nature, and after graduating with a degree in biology, he was excited about the opportunity to work and study more about the species that inhabited the region. However, there was something unsettling in the air. Jake was assigned to the night shift, where his primary responsibility was to monitor security cameras and ensure that no illegal activity happened in the most secluded areas of the park. Although the work was simple and routine, a sense of discomfort accompanied him for the first few weeks. In Clearwater, where he lived with his parents, he had heard of ancient legends about shadow creatures, but he had always believed that they were just stories told to scare children. That all changed when, while researching the park, Jake found something intriguing in the park ranger's old reports. Several reports mentioned strange sounds during the night, such as human screams and distorted laughter coming from deep in the forest. Some people claimed to have seen strange figures in the distance, creatures that looked like humans, but with animal behaviors. But what really caught his eye were the details about the glowing eyes that seemed to be reflected in the darkness. A vague but disconcerting description. Even with this warning, Jake remained skeptical. He believed that the reports were just a combination of fertile imagination and the natural fear of the dark. But when he started working at night, he felt a growing discomfort. The immensity of the forest seemed to take on a life of its own, and the darkness around it seemed to move. One night, while inspecting the security cameras, Jake came across something that would change his life forever. What appeared to be a simple deer was near the park fence, but upon closer looking, Jake noticed something strange. The animal was motionless, its eyes glowing with a golden color, as if reflecting the light of a lantern it had lit. Jake tried to concentrate, but what he saw next made him question his perception. The deer moved erratically, as if its limbs were twisted. Jake tried to contact the security team, but got no immediate response. He knew he had to go there, but something stopped him. What he was seeing didn't look natural. While Jake waited, the animal disappeared into the shadows, and he stood there with a feeling that there was something more to that moment. His mind, which had previously been focused on demystifying the legends of the park, was now full of questions. And at that very moment, Jake didn't know it, but he was about to come across something that would challenge everything he believed was possible. After the strange sighting of the deer, with its golden eyes reflecting the light of the flashlight, Jake couldn't shake the discomfort that washed over him. What he imagined to be just a story of scared campers was becoming a disturbing reality, a reality he didn't know how to explain. The silence of the forest, the stare of the deer, and the feeling of being watched, all of this indicated that something was moving in the shadows, lurking. The next night was even stranger. Jake didn't share his experience with the other team members right away. He wanted to appear rational, not to want to be seen as someone who allowed himself to be dominated by fear. But the restlessness continued to creep through his mind. It was then that he decided to tell Zach, one of the park's experienced rangers. Zach, who was 27 years old and had been working as a park ranger for almost 5 years, was used to the challenges of the park, but Jake soon realized that he wasn't as relaxed as he seemed. Zach, although he seemed calm, had a story of his own to tell, something that in his youth would mark him forever. Years ago, when Zach was just 17 years old, he and some friends were camping in a remote area in the Yellowstone Hills. That night, they heard screams, something that sounded human but with a distorted hue, as if imitating a familiar voice. When Zach and his friends tried to approach to investigate, the sound abruptly ceased, and all they found was an empty clearing. They returned to the camp scared, but what disturbed them most was that when Zach was lying in his tent later, he heard his own voice calling him out. The voice was clear, but no one was around. From that moment on, he began to question whether there were things in the forest that he didn't understand. This experience, which Zach had always kept secret, began to revive in his mind as he listened to Jake's words about the deer. "Do you think it might be what I heard when I was younger?" Jake asked, trying to understand what was going on. Zach was silent for a moment before replying with a slight hesitation. "I don't know, Jake. But there is something in the forest. Something that, as much as we try to ignore, is there." Meanwhile, Lucy, the team's 30-year-old ecology expert, maintained a more scientific approach to the events. Raised in a big city, she always had a logical mindset and was not given to superstitions. But even she couldn't ignore the growing discomfort she felt while they were in the park. During one of her rounds, Lucy found marks on the ground that didn't correspond to any known animals, and something about her began to change. That didn't seem normal. "These footprints don't make sense," she said to Jake, trying to explain the sensation that was growing inside her. "I believe in science, Jake, but I can't ignore that something is strange here." As the three progressed in their investigations, the atmosphere in the park became increasingly tense. They were beginning to notice that something was watching them, something they couldn't identify. The sounds, the unexplained noises during the night, the shadows that seemed to move. All of this began to become a tangible presence. They didn't know if it was an animal, an illusion of the mind, or something darker, but the fear could no longer be ignored. That night, when the moon was high in the sky and the wind was whispering through the trees, Jake found himself alone, sitting in front of the park's security hut, trying to process everything that happened. He looked up at the forest in front of him, the shadows dancing under the light of the lantern, and felt the presence of something far away, but very close. Something that somehow he knew was there, waiting, watching. Something that perhaps was much more real than he imagined. As the days passed, Jake, Zach, and Lucy began to realize that the unexplained events at Pine Ridge Park weren't just coincidences. What initially seemed like a sequence of isolated incidents was becoming something much more sinister. Something, or someone, was watching them. But it wasn't just the silent presence in the forest that disturbed them. It was the way this being acted, as if he had learned to imitate, to deceive, to play with his perceptions. The concept of imitation and deception is central to the story of the Skinwalker, the creature they were beginning to suspect to be the cause of the strange events. According to legends, a Skinwalker possesses the supernatural ability to transform into any being, whether animal or human, and mimic its characteristics and behaviors. The legend, originating in the Navajo, describes an evil being capable of perfectly disguising itself to lure its victims, deceive them, and often hunt them down without them noticing. The idea of deception, therefore, is not limited to the visuals. The Skinwalker can even imitate the voices of well-known people, distorting reality and confusing its victims. For Jake, who has always trusted his senses and his ability to understand the nature around him, this possibility was incomprehensible. He always believed that if he could closely observe the behavior of animals, understand their actions, he could identify any behavior out of the ordinary. However, as he and the others began to notice more oddities, the line between what was real and what was being manipulated seemed to begin to unravel. On the third night the trio was in the park. Zack, who was at a more isolated vantage point, heard something that made him freeze. A familiar voice, the same one he heard many years. "Ego," called his name. "Zack, Zack," the voice echoed softly, coming from the darkness. At first he thought it was a trick of the mind, but when he looked in the direction of the sound, he saw a figure standing among the trees, his pale face illuminated by the faint light of the moon. He approached slowly, calling out the name of the person he imagined himself to be. As he approached, the figure disappeared, leaving Zack with a cold feeling that something was wrong. What he didn't know, and Jake and Lucy would later discover, is that the creature, whether it's the skinwalker or something even older and more unknown, not only mimics physical appearances, but also voices. Something that can confuse and manipulate, turning the familiar into something frighteningly unrecognizable. This ability to imitate so perfectly was something that neither of them was prepared to face. While Zack was trapped in a sense of indescribable terror, Jake, who was still trying to maintain his rationality, saw something even more disturbing. When reviewing the security camera footage, a figure that initially appeared to be a missing ranger briefly appeared in the footage. The first time Jake saw it, he thought it was just a distortion, but when he looked again, he noticed something even stranger. The figure, although it looked human, did not move like a normal person. It seemed to be writhing. Its steps were strangely heavy, as if it were imitating someone, but imperfectly. Lucy, more skeptical of all this, could not ignore what was in front of her eyes. When she and Jake began to discuss what they had seen, she realized that she was beginning to question her own perception of reality. The creatures they were investigating, according to the reports they were hearing and the images they were reviewing, were acting in increasingly strange and disconcerting ways. The imitation of the voice, the distorted way of moving, and even the way the shadows seemed to change as they were watched, all of this indicated that they were dealing with something far beyond human comprehension. Imitation was not limited to physical appearance. It extended to emotions and behaviors. The skinwalker, or the being they were facing, was manipulating their perceptions in such a way that with each step they took, they began to lose track of what was true. This left them vulnerable. It was an invisible threat, where the danger was not in something they could see right away, but rather in something that disguised itself beneath the layers of reality. Who was real? What was real? And what were you waiting for to attack? With each passing night, the feeling of isolation became more palpable. Jake, Zack, and Lucy, now deeply immersed in the depths of Pine Ridge, could no longer deny the weight of what they were facing. The forest seemed to take on a life of its own, with every tree, every leaf, and even the wind, seeming to whisper secrets that were not to be heard. Fear, once just a distant sensation, now became a constant companion, and the unknown, which had once seemed distant and harmless, drew ever closer. The park, with its secluded trails and vast expanses of forest, was no longer just a workplace. It was now a prison. Jake never imagined that after weeks of patrolling, he would feel so disconnected from the outside world. The communication radio, once a reliable tool, now seemed to be useless, with constant static and few responses. They were alone. The safety messages, the updates from the teams, and even the simple sound of the outside world were gone. It was as if the park had closed itself around them, as if nature itself was swallowing them. The isolation began to affect the three of them in different ways. For Jake, the sense of loneliness was exacerbated by growing doubt about his own sanity. He knew that what he was seeing could not be real, but what then was going on? Each step deeper into the forest seemed to erase them from reality, as if the very existence of the park was being distorted. What he had believed to be just a coincidence or a figment of the imagination began to turn into a constant, something he could no longer ignore. Zack, for his part, dealt with isolation in a more personal way. The fear came not only from the creature that was watching them, but from the very place they were. As a young man, the Yellowstone forest had been a place of mystery and danger, but he always had the feeling that there was something more, something darker that he couldn't understand. The memory of that night, when he heard his own voice being imitated, now haunted him more strongly. The silence in the forest seemed to increase her own anxiety. Every strange sound, every movement in the shadows made him think that perhaps he was about to relive that experience of terror. The fear of the unknown was becoming something much more concrete for Zach. Lucy, being the most skeptical of the group, struggled with the growing sense of powerlessness. She always believed that nature could be explained rationally, that everything could be understood with study and observation. However, as the days passed and the strange phenomena intensified, she felt her trust in science being eroded. The evidence was there, the erratic behaviors of the fauna, the inexplicable sounds, the voices that distorted deep in the forest. The unknown, which she once believed to be a myth, was now becoming a real presence, and she didn't know how to fight it. As if that wasn't enough, the dread of losing control of her own sanity began to haunt her as well. Isolation began to become the biggest enemy. They couldn't trust what they saw or heard, and the deep silence of the forest only made the feeling of being watched worse. They were trapped in a space where normal no longer existed. The fear of the unknown, of what they could not see but felt, began to expand within them. The presence of the creature, or whatever it was, seemed to invade every corner of the forest, and with that, the very minds of the three of them began to disintegrate under the pressure. That night, while patrolling a more remote area, Jake and Zach came across something impossible to ignore. In the middle of the clearing, a human-looking but strangely deformed figure was standing, watching them. She didn't move, but her eyes shone with a golden hue, as if they were reflecting the light of the flashlight. But what was most disturbing wasn't the appearance of the figure. It was the feeling that she was waiting, watching them with frightening patience. Zach, with his heart racing, took the lead and called for the figure, but she did not answer. Without further explanation, the figure disappeared into the shadows, as if it had never been there. Lucy, who was some distance away, heard Zach's scream and ran to them, but when she arrived, the clearing was empty, as if nothing had happened. There were no footprints, no sign that anything had moved, but the feeling that they were being hunted was real. And now, more than ever, they were aware that they were not alone. Something, or someone, was controlling the game, and they were the pieces. As the nights lengthened, the pressure on Jake, Zach, and Lucy became unbearable. The immense and unforgiving environment of Pine Ridge Park, with its dense vegetation and the unusual echoes of the forest, seemed to squeeze their minds, and a sense of distrust began to seep into their actions and thoughts. Isolation, which initially made them feel distant from the outside world, now made them question even each other's sanity. Jake, always the most rational, was the first to notice the change. What was once an unshakable belief in his scientific logic began to crumble. He began to notice small details that he had previously ignored, shadows that moved erratically, noises that seemed to come from the wrong direction, and a constant sense of being watched, even when he was alone. The idea that something or someone was manipulating their perceptions grew by the day. The psychological pressure increased. He no longer knew if the sounds he heard were real or the product of his own mind, which began to give way under the strain. Zach, on the other hand, could no longer discern the difference between reality and what he believed to be a nightmare. He was consumed by paranoia. What started as a single strange incident years ago now seemed to repeat itself. When a familiar voice called to him from a distance, he no longer knew if he was hearing something genuine or if his mind was playing tricks. He began to avoid eye contact with Jake and Lucy, fearing that somehow it was also an imitation, a distortion of his own perception. With each furtive glance, he felt the weight of panic, as if his own sanity was being tested at every moment. Lucy, the skeptic, was on the verge of losing confidence in her own judgment. As a trained scientist, she has always relied on method and observation. But what happened in the park challenged all his beliefs. The events and the growing sense of disorientation made her doubt her own perception of reality. She knew that the forest had a great influence on people's psychology, but what they were experiencing seemed to go beyond what she could explain. She began to avoid the quiet moments, always looking for some kind of distraction to keep her mind from getting lost in terrifying thoughts. However, the more she tried to move away from fear, the more it surrounded her. The trio was slowly being consumed by the feeling that there was no escape from their own mind. The strange events began to become more frequent. When there were no screams or shadowy figures, there was only absolute silence, which was more frightening than any sound. The sound of nature, which had once been a source of comfort for Jake, Zach, and Lucy, now seemed to turn into something disturbing, a curtain of noises that left them at the mercy of their own anxiety. The fear that something or someone was constantly watching them made it increasingly difficult to focus on work or any simple task. The next night, Jake, desperate to find some explanation for what was happening, decided to go deeper into the woods. He was convinced that he needed to confront head-on what was affecting his perception. Zach, upon hearing Jake's plan, hesitated but finally agreed to accompany him. Lucy, already exhausted both physically and mentally, stayed behind, guarding the camp. But what Jake and Zach didn't know was that the simple act of walking away from camp would put them squarely on the front lines of something much bigger and scarier. As they advanced through the forest, the sounds began to become more intense until they turned into a murmur. Suddenly, Jake and Zach clearly heard their own names whispered by the trees. A sense of dread washed over them, and Zach once again began to doubt reality. Jake, as much as he tried to stay calm, felt the same tension in his spine, as if it was confirmation that they were being watched, or worse, manipulated by something they couldn't see but knew was there. The shadows of the forest deepened as Jake, Zach, and Lucy moved forward, driven by the feeling that they were being watched. The weight of fear and paranoia that had consumed them in recent weeks now materialized into something tangible. What seemed to be a game of mind and illusions was now real, and they were facing something darker than they could have imagined. The threat was approaching, and the only thing left to do was to face it. The moment the deformed figure appeared before them, reality shattered into pieces. Zach, paralyzed, stood motionless at the sight of the strange silhouette in the distance. The creature's golden eyes reflected the light from its flashlights, while it seemed to move erratically, as if it was fighting its own body. The figure was not human nor fully animal. It seemed like a grotesque mixture of both things, a deformity of flesh and shadows. "We can't stay here. We need to get out now," shouted Zach, his voice tinged with panic. But the creature, seemingly aware of its fear, moved toward them, making its escape impossible. The dense air of the forest seemed to swallow their screams, and the silence was filled only by the irregular sounds of the creature. It was a feeling of suffocation, as if the environment itself was against them. Jake, normally the calmest of the group, could no longer afford to hesitate. He grabbed his flashlight tightly, his sweaty fingers trembling, and pointed the light directly at the creature. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the distorted being, but instead of retreating, the creature moved forward, as if the light challenged it, as if it were unable to understand what was hitting it. With her heart pounding in her chest, Lucy was the first to react. She grabbed a stick from the ground and advanced towards the figure, trying to push it away with one blow. But when he touched her, what happened was even more horrible. The being writhed, his body momentarily undone, as if he were rebuilding himself before them. The flesh seemed to tear and reconstitute itself, changing shape in an almost supernatural way. With each movement, the creature grew stranger, more unrecognizable. "That's not possible," Lucy murmured, her voice trembling as she saw what seemed like a distortion of reality. Jake, feeling the weight of the situation, pulled the others back. They couldn't beat the creature with anything more than sticks or flashlights, but the idea of running seemed even more terrifying. The feeling that they were being hunted, not only physically but psychologically, paralyzed them. Every step they took, it felt like the forest was closing in around them, as if it was turning into a prison with no way out. The creature, getting closer and closer, began to imitate the sounds of the trees breaking, the howling winds, creating an almost deaf and unbearable environment for the trio. But most terrifying of all was the imitation of their own family's voices, distorted, whispering words that only they recognized. The fear took on even greater proportions when the creature whispered Zach's name, distorting it in a horrific way. "Zach, Zach, you will regret it." The voice sounded like an echo, but at the same time, as if it were a call for imminent death. Zach, now in total panic, took a step back, but the creature moved forward, as if determined to close in on him. The feeling of being hunted, of being manipulated by something they couldn't see, made them feel like puppets in a much bigger game. Every move they made, every attempt to escape, seemed only to infuriate the entity. It was at this moment that Jake had a desperate idea. He remembered an old legend he had heard from his grandfather about how creatures of this kind could be driven away by direct light or fire. He yelled for Zach and Lucy to run to the clearing ahead, where there was a fire already lit. But he couldn't wait. With a last-ditch effort, he threw a flask of fuel over the bushes around the creature and lit a match, creating a barrier of flame. To his surprise, the creature retreated, moving away from the flames, but not in a defeated manner. It just fell apart, distorting into an even more grotesque shape before disappearing into the shadows of the forest. The relief was momentary, but the feeling that what they were facing was not yet over remained with them. The fire illuminated the clearing, but the darkness of the forest seemed even thicker, more threatening. The fire, which had once seemed to be their only protection, now left them more vulnerable than ever. The creature, though temporarily driven away by the flames, was not defeated. Jake, Zach, and Lucy were surrounded by darkness, the feeling of being watched even stronger than before. Whatever was hunting them was no longer a simple legend or an illusion of the mind. It was a supernatural force that enveloped them, and they were completely at the mercy of it. The biting wind of night seemed to increase, whispering unintelligible words, as if the forest was speaking to them. The branches of the trees creaked, and as the shadows lengthened, a sense of claustrophobia came over the trio. There was no longer any safe space. The park, with its familiar trails and beautiful landscapes, now became a deadly labyrinth, where each step took them deeper into the nightmare. The sounds, once just disconcerting, were now terrifying. When Zach took a step back, his heart raced. He heard a low whisper, a murmur that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Zach! Zach!" The voice was distorted, but unmistakable. Your mother's voice. Or at least, the voice he recognized. "Zach, you have abandoned me." The sound was not coming from anywhere, of course. It was like an illusion, but the desperation in his voice felt too real. His mind began to break under the pressure, and the feeling of despair consumed him. Lucy, who had stood her ground until that moment, was now visibly shaken. She knew that the legends of skinwalkers spoke of an ability to mimic human voices, but the terror of hearing her own voice distorted, calling it from deep in the forest, made her stomach turn. She clearly heard her mother asking for help, but she knew it was impossible. It was just another way for the creature to manipulate their minds. The perfect imitation of familiar voices was one of the most terrifying weapons because it made them doubt their own perception of reality. Jake was panicking but still struggling to maintain control. He knew that the creature, whatever it was testing them, playing on their deepest fears. What once looked like a subtle hunt now revealed itself as a direct attack. They were being pushed to the limit of their mental capabilities. And no matter how hard they tried to resist, psychological terror was about to knock them down. It was then that the figure appeared again. But this time, there were no more doubts about its nature. The creature was before them, more concrete than ever. She was no longer disguising herself. She was no longer trying to imitate something human. It was pure distortion, a monstrosity of flesh, bone, and shadow. Her eyes, large and golden, reflected the light from Jake's flashlight, but the light no longer paralyzed her. She moved with an unearthly fluidity, as if her form was no longer limited by the laws of physics. Zack tried to take a step back, but his feet were glued to the ground, as if something invisible was holding him back. The creature slowly approached, its sharp claws glowing in the darkness. She was feeding off her fear, growing more powerful by the moment. Lucy, desperate, tried to raise her rod again, but the weight of terror made her fail. She fell to her knees, unable to act, her face contorted with dread. Jake, now on the verge of collapse, finally understood what was happening. The creature wasn't just watching them. It was feeding on their fears, distorting their perceptions, and that made them even more vulnerable. They were being devoured from within, not just physically, but psychologically. The only way to survive, Jake realized, was to confront what they feared most. But how to face something that messed with their minds the way it was doing? With one last reserve of strength, Jake shouted at the others, trying to bring back the controller. "Stay together. Don't let it get into your heads." But his voice sounded weak, drowned out by the intensity of the terror that enveloped them. The sound of his words seemed to be lost in the vastness of the forest, and the creature, with its piercing gaze, charged forward once more. The creature approached, its shuffling, uncertain footsteps echoing in the cold, dense night. Her every move seemed overwhelming, as if the very space around her was writhing. Fear, once just a distant, opaque presence in the minds of Jake, Zack, and Lucy, was now real, palpable, and they were completely immersed in it. They were facing terror in its purest form, a terror that was not limited to the physical, but that penetrated the deepest layers of their psyches. Psychological fear began to crumble the last remaining barriers. Zack, with his eyes fixed on the creature, broke out in a cold sweat. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was not. The voice he had heard before, his mother's voice, now seemed to be only an echo from the depths of his mind, an illusion that was slowly destroying him. He found himself paralyzed, unable to move a muscle, unable to scream, trapped in a state of complete terror. His legs trembled, and his breathing became shallow, almost non-existent. Lucy, feeling the weight of despair, tried to fight back, but her mind was in tatters. She, who had always considered herself a rational person, now found herself facing something that challenged all her beliefs. The skinwalker, or whatever it was beyond any logical explanation. The creature, as it got even closer, seemed to understand their vulnerability and fed on it. The normally powerful fight-and-flight instinct had been lost in the void of distrust and panic. Lucy began to question whether leaving was even a possibility. Would it be possible to leave that forest with some sanity still intact? Were they another victim of the legends? Jake, trying to muster what was left of his strength, shouted, "Stay together! Don't believe what you're seeing! Don't believe the voices!" But his words seemed so empty, so meaningless, before the creature who watched them with eyes injected with an unearthly gold. The beast did not advance in a hurry. but with a frightening calm, as if it were toying with them, forcing them to see themselves as weak, vulnerable, and at the mercy of their own mind. With each step she took, the pressure increased. The terror came not only from the creature's body, but from everything it represented. The imitation of familiar voices, the distortion of reality that they had begun to perceive, was becoming a mental prison. Jake felt that his own thoughts were beginning to dissolve, as if he was in a never-ending nightmare, and every thought he tried to form was erased by the growing darkness around him. Loneliness, isolation, and doubt began to overwhelm them in ways they could not control. They were at the mercy not only of the creature, but of their own minds. The trio, now completely immersed in dread, found themselves further away from salvation with each passing second. The figure came closer and closer, and with it, the feeling. The death or oblivion was about to become a concrete reality. There were no easy answers anymore. There was no longer a simple way to get out of there. The imitation of the creature was overstepping the limits of human perception, and the fear of not knowing what was real took hold of them irreversibly. Then something unexpected happened. The creature, which until now had seemed relentless, suddenly stopped. She stood still, her distorted form trembling, as if fighting an unseen force. The voices, which had hitherto sounded so real, now began to disappear, as if they were being erased one by one. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jake, Zach, and Lucy were so paralyzed by tension that they could barely breathe. But what did this sudden silence mean? The silence, which for a moment seemed to have conquered the forest, abruptly broke. Fear, now deeply ingrained in the minds of Jake, Zach, and Lucy, had brought them to the brink of the psychological abyss. The creature, or whatever it was, disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of helplessness. All three were exhausted, not only physically but spiritually, consumed by doubt and the constant struggle to distinguish what was real from what was a terrifying invention of the mind. As the darkness closed in again around them, something inside them began to disintegrate. What they had experienced was not just a chase by a visible beast, but a never-ending psychological game. The voices, distorted faces, and golden eyes were not only a manifestation of a malicious being, but a reflection of his own deepest fears. They were being devoured not only by the creature, but by the very idea of the unknown, of that which they could not control or understand. Jake, who at first believed he had the situation under control, was now aware that terror is not just a simple logical explanation. He was no longer sure where reality began and where the nightmare ended. His very concept of safety and normalcy crumbled in the face of something that could not be explained, something that challenged all his understanding of nature and reason. The park, once seen as a place of study and adventure, was now a psychological battleground where the laws of physics and logic were irrelevant. Zach, meanwhile, was broke. The voices, distorted and familiar, had invaded his mind in such a way that he could barely make out his own sanity. The childhood experience in which he heard his own voice imitated no longer seemed like a distant memory, but a cruelly repeated reality. What would happen if he gave in to that fear? What would happen to his mind if he were not able to escape the illusion? The creature had left its mark, but not physically. She had marked him psychologically in a way he didn't know if he could overcome. Lucy, normally the most rational, did not escape unscathed. The fear she felt when facing the creature was just the beginning. The greatest terror was the feeling that, in trying to resist fear, she was sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss of confusion and disorientation. What they faced was not a mere creature, but a force that corroded everything she believed to be true. For her, the conclusion was not just the creature's escape, but the inevitable acceptance that the unknown could never be controlled, only faced. What, then, would be left for the three of them after this experience? Surviving didn't just mean physically escaping, but carrying with it the weight of what they couldn't understand. Whatever it was that haunted them had scarred their souls, and the truth that emerged from this experience was not a simple explanation, but a reminder that the unknown is not just a force that dwells in the shadows. It resides in each of us, in the back of our minds, where our greatest fears and weaknesses hide. Now, while Jake, Zach, and Lucy leave the forest behind, they can no longer go back to their former selves. The fear you have experienced will not leave you, and the shadow of that which has observed you in the depths of the night will follow you. The real terror was not in the creature itself, but in the revelation that what they faced was only a manifestation of what resides in the darkest parts of their own minds. They may have escaped physically, but the cost of facing the unknown is something everyone will have to carry. And as they move away from the forest, the question persists. What is more dangerous? What is in the shadows, or what resides in ourselves?